How can the small Coyote engine run with the big blocks and other small blocks and end up beating and dominating? I'll try to explain as best I could. But before that, let's look at some pit action. Please subscribe, like, and share. Hello, everyone. Merry Christmas. And thank you for tuning in to Ben Alameda Racing. Today we will talk about something different. All right, I'll try to do an explanation. I hope I get feedback from a lot of you guys. What I want to touch subject on is about this doggone Coyote engine layout. With Brett LaSalle, with that SNOTT rocket, how it's able to run with a lot of the big blocks for the Dragon drive. Just think about the configuration, why it has so much advantage. Here's that engine, a Coyote, small block, either it's a 5.0 or a 5.2. This is what we will be talking about, why this has such an advantage. Racing against a lot bigger engines, these are stock factory casting on the heads, the block. Lately, he went to a billet block. Still that does not cut down on its reputation. Imagine running this kind of times with a stock casting block and heads. Amazing. Oh, also, by the way, Coyote 4V heads will not have big flow numbers on the top of the scale. But their low lift, mid-range flow is going to be very impressive. I remember years ago, I worked on a Mercedes-Benz 24 of Daytona, 12 hours of Sebring team. And they gave me an SLR, the V8 configuration that they run. And guess what? This thing flowed. It looks like an overgrown Coyote engine. And it flowed 390 out of the box. I worked 2 weeks and picked up low and mid-range flow. That's all. I didn't want to make the ports any bigger than they are because I know I'll lose velocity and the column charge is going to slow down. Because remember, this NA and the intake manifold is quite fancy. But it ended up on a big lawsuit, $1 million, I should say that, lawsuit against another company. So I had to bow out of that and conclude my R&D with the Mercedes-Benz team because this manifold came from someplace, all right? And they wanted it back. I don't want to be involved in the full shenanigans of a lawsuit. But 390 CFM is very, very impressive. Not that long ago, I had somebody call me up from out of state and said, "Hey, Ben, I like your explanation on what's going on here." I go, "Yeah, what seems to be the problem?" We have basically our street cars, heads-up class showing up at the drag strip. Factory layout. But apparently what's going on is that these doggone Mustangs with the Coyotes are showing up and just tearing everybody up. I said, heads up, Yeah, he goes, boosted. Most of them running turbo. I go, okay. So what seems to be the problem? Says all the other configuration, NA, it doesn't really dominate, but under boost, especially a turbo, this doggone Coyote engines are very, very fast. I said, okay, I understand. I know what you mean. He goes, well, why do you think so? I said, well, I go, let me remind you, not that long ago, this was, oh my gosh, many, many years ago. I said, remember the engine masters? 3 Coyote engines showed up to compete, and guess what they did? They ended up 1, 2, and 3. Right after that, the engine masters said, no more Coyote setups. All right? Or 4-valve engines to be included. It's all overhead valve domestic V8 configuration, because really, when you look at the Coyote, it almost looked like a doggone import engine, an oversized import engine. So here we go. This is what happened.
Here's the write up. I did not post the magazine or the video because I might be in violation with some other people's um, intellectual property rights. So I did this AI and asked why is it bad, and here are the reasons why. So it is indeed, like I remember, 1, 2, and 3, and that was the end of that deal. Next year they were not allowed. So all this is telling you really is the theoretical and factual advantage of the engine, how it can produce power per cubic inch, superior to just about anything. But because of its displacement, it will not have as much torque comparable to somebody with a lot more bigger cubic inch. And like I said, there's no replacement for displacement but RPM. These things do rev. Okay, so it helps it, especially when it's boosted, not when it's NA. Then you will see the problem with the limitation of the cubic inches being 5.0.
They took 1, 2, and 3. That's it. I told them the only way you could even out the competition is you gotta have to do restrictions on the inlet side of the turbo or supercharger. NA, they're easier pickings. You can beat them. They'll give you a good run, but still under boost, because it's artificially the displacement of 5.50 or 5.2, whatever they might be. Guess what? It's artificially injected with cubic inches via airflow. Because remember, when an engine's at 5 liter, okay, and then you boost it 1 bar or 1 atmosphere, that is now twice as displacement. That engine is basically a 6 liter. When you boost it another atmosphere, now it becomes even bigger than that. 900 cubic inches for three atmospheres. Remember, we're not looking at the increase in displacement, the increase in displacement of what's going into the engine by airflow. It's equal to, right, a 7 liter engine at 3 pounds of boost. I mean, 3 atmospheres of boost. It's 3 times its displacement. That you got to look at. Now, this said, what happened lately with this SNOTT rocket? Doggone car is kicking everybody. And he's won a lot. He lost some. Coyote. 5.0, 5.2, or now with the billet block, I guess it's probably 5.7 or 5.6. You got to look at it this way. For the longest time, he ran on the stock block configuration with sleeves. Very many engines, especially aluminum blocks, have sleeves as well. Now, that said, really, if it's still the stock configuration, stock casting with sleeves, I have no problem with that. You can sleeve any engine. That's fine. But he is doggone dominating just about every race he goes to. Think about this. Why is that? That's what I'm going to try to explain here. All right? First off, there's probably a little bit of of difference in weight. But according to drag and drive in some of these um, configuration, I think it's 2400 for a small block, 2850 for a big block. But if you have a Coyote configuration or something like a 4-valve layout, you add 200 pounds more. So really now, the difference of 450 pounds now is like 250 pounds against a big block. All right, so there are adjustments for ultimate cubic inch or the final cubic inches, but you can see right there. All right, so let's just say there's a 258-pound separation between the two. That is still freaking impressive, considering that it's a vastly smaller engine. Okay, these guys have, a big cubic inch, 500 plus, 600 cubic inch maybe, or maybe bigger. But one thing they don't have is RPM. Like I said before in one of my videos, there's no substitute for cubic inches but RPMs. So when you have a big block that's turning 7,500 or maybe 8,000, and one guy's turning 10,000, 2,000 more, 2,000 RPMs more, that's big. Now you have this big cubic inch supercharged nitrous or turbo, but it's limited to 7,500, if that, or maybe 8,000. Let's give it. Let's say it's 8,000. But I bet you, if a big block's turning 8,000, it's not that big. It's not 700 or something like that. All right. More likely, but there are exceptions. More likely, it's around maybe 8,500 tops. But you got something like a overhead cam 4-valve layout Coyote turning 10. Okay, they said SNOTT rocket turns 10 grand. I don't know if they're even telling the truth. They could be 12,000. All right, so let me also give a shout out to MMR, Modular Mustang Racing, out there here in California. And these other guys are fast forward racing engine. Both of them Coyote builders. Very, very impressive. There's some out there also. AccuFab is another one. So I will try to explain here what is really going on. Why is this so? So here we go. First thing, the Coyotes have a small bore. What's that, 3,700 maybe? All right, I think it's something 3,500, 3,700. And then you look at the big blocks, there are 4, what's a standard thing? 250? That's big. But, now they're up to what, 4,500, 4,600? Okay, for the big bore. So, like I said in some of my videos, I've always stated that a big bore is more susceptible to detonation. So here we are. Let's just say we have a 4,600 bore big block. The spark plug is here on the very end of the combustion chamber. When you initiate the sphere of ignition, it goes further up towards the end of the cylinder wall. Right around the intake valve, closest to the cylinder wall, is where it's farthest away from the spark plug. What happens here is you have a temperature and pressure spike. Boom, auto detonation. That's normally aspirated. Now you include nitrous, boost, the supercharged or turbo. Now you've created even a worse scenario. It's big. There's a pressure and temperature spike towards the end of the intake valve, where it's the leanest, because it could quite turn into the short side. When it's leanest, the temperature pressure spike, boom, auto ignition or detonation starts. That's a given with a big bore layout. Just think about it. Okay? That's NA, worse when it's got some kind of aspiration, nitrous, or boost of turbo or supercharged. Now you look at the Coyote. 3.5, maybe 3.7. But here's the scenario. The spark plug is towards the middle of the combustion chamber. What is the middle? It emanates, the ignition kernel or sphere starts from the middle. Hopefully it reaches towards the very end of the 2 intake valves where it's also lean because of the short side. Guess what happened? When you cover that before the temperature and pressure increases on the ends of the intake valve closest on the wall, gets to a critical level, hopefully you've covered that with the combustion front, that it covered it up and basically ignited whatever is going to ignite. So the temperature and pressure spike doesn't result in auto ignition. It is consumed. Once it's consumed, there's no more. The chances of this isolated eddies or lean areas around that is refusing to burn or very slow to burn is further eliminated with a smaller bore. You can cover that so much more, as opposed to a big bore with so much more distance to try to burn its way through and cover the whole combustion chamber. Now, on the Coyote type engines and stuff, when you have this configuration, smaller bore, compact chamber, spark plug in the middle, it is ideal by far compared to overhead valve configuration, where a spark plug is on the other edge of the combustion chamber. Sometimes the dome gets in the way of the spark plug, so the spark plug location gets higher than usual. With the new aftermarket blocks, there you go. What happens there is that it has to climb over the dome. But on a 4-valve layout, the spark plug is on the top. Even if you have a big dome, it's starting here. Okay? Not here. And trying to go over. All right? It's right here. So there you go. The chances of covering the whole combustion space and igniting or burning, I should say, igniting, so almost like an explosion. The fast burn is completed all through the critical area, even on the slower side of the rich side towards exhaust. That's fine. All right? The issue is on the intake side, as always. So now let's talk about the cubic inches, the stroke. That's what we're going to zero in. Remember, these Coyotes are short stroke. It lends itself to a freer revving engine. The crank is lighter, the rods are lighter, the piston's smaller in diameter, everything's a lot more lighter. It can rev much quicker than a big block with a heavy crank, heavier rod, bigger bore, which results in heavier pistons. That by itself is already a disadvantage. Remember, the bigger the cubic inch, the less efficient it becomes because it's slinging away so much more mass. From reciprocating mass to valve train mass, camshaft, everything is heavy. Now, on the Coyote platform, the valves are light. The valve train are light. Okay? So, you're not swinging away or opening up rapidly and closing those tiny intake and exhaust valves. Coupled with valve springs compared to the big blocks, it is almost, you're already going to get beat. Now, with the stroke, it lends itself to more RPM. It'll free rev much quicker than a long stroke engine. Case in point, we ran a car before with a massively stroked 351 Windsor. 454 plus, I think like 462 or something like that, against the same car we put our legal motor at 409, 410. Let's round off to 410 cubic inches. Think about this. The 410, being a lot smaller, did not really run that much slower. The big cubic inch stroke 351, all right, 9.5 deck, ran less than a tenth quicker than our little engine at a 375 stroke as opposed to 4250 plus on the bigger one. So you can see the importance of RPM. The big stroke engine, basically the same weight. ran less than a tenth quicker, an 89 to an 82, or 88 to an 82. Think about this. That had a Dominator compared to the little engine with a 4150 flange and carburetor versus a 4150, you know, carburetor type. So right there, it had a bigger plenum, bigger throttle plates, everything, and managed to only ran less than a tenth. Go figure this out. Because if that was just an eighth mile, I sincerely believe it was a quarter mile, the long stroke engine is just going to have a hard time pedaling itself through the RPM. But the short stroke, just like the Coyotes, will start to rev freer towards the top end. And perhaps at a smaller cubic inches, bore diameter being the same, we'll probably have faster ETs and track speed. Because towards the end, it's able to pull along more efficiently. Long stroke engines like Daddy Long Legs, all right? It's got long ways to per stride and probably tripping it so big. It's kind of blowing up. So, okay, excuse the pun there. But what I'm saying is that the higher the RPM, the more it's freer with a shorter stroke. Okay? Oh, get back to the bore. How much boost can a big bore engine tolerate? Okay? A lot of boost. I don't know how much they're pushing, right? 40, 50 maybe. The chances under boost condition with a big bore, the chances of detonation is so much more possible. With a Coyote layout or small bore 4-valve configuration, the boost can be up big time. Because like I said, the diameter of the bore is so much smaller, lending itself to less pressure and temperature spikes on the isolated areas, so it's more tolerant of pre-ignition or boost levels much higher than an overhead valve big bore engine combination and long stroke. What do you do this way? The Coyote, like Formula One, 4-valve layout. Think about this. Guess how much compression the Indy engines have? When you look at the Coyote and you look at the Indy engines, very, very close, like most 4V configuration. Very, very close. Guess what? 18 to 1 on a Formula One, but they're on methanol, granted. All right? Now they're mandated to go 16 to 1. Still a lot. 5.5 bar of boost. 5 times the atmospheric pressure. So really, when you look at airflow-wise, that engine is 5 times bigger than what it really is. So when a Coyote is sitting at 5 liter and you boost it 3 bars, 3 atmosphere, it's 3 times its size. 5, 300, 600, 900 cubic inches now at 3 atmosphere. So you have a 900 cubic inch big block that can't turn past 8,500. Is already having a hard time at 8,000. Then you have something like that that's turning 10,000. That's what they admit, but I think it's a lot more than that. Probably 12. Heaven knows. That's their secret. These guys will turn a lot higher than that. Remember, Formula One turns 19 until they mandated them down to like 15,000 RPM. But they can turn that much more than any engine configuration. Now, one thing they'll put a death knell on just about every engine. There's some Coyote engine builders out there ended up applying and building a nitrogen valve drain, no valve spring, but nitrogen gas. Now the RPM potential for this engine even goes sky high. So when you figure you're trying to RPM a V8 engine with a big valve, just think about this. You have a 245 intake valve on a typical mountain motor. The diameter of the valve plus how far it is from the corner to the stem, that far more distance, it is basically exposed to more combustion heat. The intake valve is basically exposed to more combustion heat. The bigger the diameter, then it has a farther distance to go to the valve stem, to the valve guide, and to the coolant system. Consequently, on a Coyote engine or any of those small engines with 4-valve layout, the intake valve is so much more smaller. The distance between the end of the valve to the stem, to the guide, to the coolant system is a shorter path. And guess what happens with that? The valve gets cooler by far. All right, now remember, in Formula One, for us overhead valve layouts, the limitation to combustion pressures and how it starts to detonate and destroy itself is that the exhaust valve gets hot. On the Formula One, the intake valve gets hot because the intake valves are significantly bigger than the exhaust valve. So they start to glow orange on a Formula One engine. So the limitation to them is the diameter of the intake valve, how much is exposed to the combustion. And the distance from the valve diameter to the guide, to the valve stem, to the guide, to the water jacket, so much more farther. So the limiting factor is intake valve temperature. Whereas on the overhead valve, mountain motors, the exhaust valve, again, is bigger. So much more farther away from the valve diameter, let's say 180, 185, to the center of the stem, transferred to the guide, and eventually to the water jackets. It's so much more. So now the exhaust valve runs hot or hotter. Then when we look at the 4-valve layout, the exhaust valves are significantly smaller. When you look at Formula One, the intake valve is big, the exhaust valve is smaller. Consequently, the heat path goes from the valve diameter to the stem, to the guide, and to the water jacket. It's a lot shorter. So they tend to run much cooler. And also, think about this. Issue with boosted engines today for V8, American V8s, is we end up running a steel rocker arm. Why? Because the bigger the exhaust diameter and the combustion pressure is so much more, heat, everything, we end up breaking the exhaust rocker arm. It will not open up. It gets worse with a bigger exhaust valve. So here we have a limitation on the diameter because of overheating issues, which is not present or not as much on a 4V Coyote layout. And even the intake valve is also running cooler comparably to the overhead valve. So all in all, the valves are running much cooler, much safer on a 4-valve layout like the Coyote compared to all the domestic V8s. That is a winner right there. There's no way you can beat that. So now let's look at the valve train for drag and drive. Why is this guy beating everybody? He drives like, what was that, 900 miles from home base to the racetrack? I tell you, the biggest I've ever put on a big block to run on the street today is 740, 750. That's pushing it. All right? I got oil going through the valve springs on a street car. Yeah, quite a bit of lift. All right? Now, compared to the Coyote platform, they basically run like if I'm running stock valve train. And they last 2 years. I can't even last too long on my titanium valve overhead valve layout. I run a conical if I can afford it. But running an overhead valve engine for drag and drive, you're going to have to get that much more power out of it. You have to have some decent amount of valve lift to enable it to flow through the cylinder head. Remember, high boost doesn't mean nothing if the head doesn't flow. What you're looking at boost is actually back pressure in reverse. The higher the boost, the more restricted the head. Okay, everything being even. Now, when you open up the head and make it really functionally free flowing, your boost will drop. Now, that with the valve spring that they run on these V8s, overhead V8s, mountain motors, or short stroke big block, they still have to run inordinate amount of lift and valve springs to survive the drag and drive. The Coyotes, they can run a stock layout, perhaps upgrade the valve spring a little bit, and they drive and drive and drive without really breaking any rocker arm follower or whatever. Okay, so you can just see the difference. The valve train weight is significantly lighter, requiring less valve springs. That's why it's not surprising when MMR, AccuFab, Fast Forward, all the other Ford Coyote Indians or Coyote builders, they run hardly any modified or exotic valve train. They basically are close to stock configuration. You can't beat that. And they last a long doggone time. All right? So just think about that. Drag and drag. I don't know if I could. I'd probably go with a short stroke big block, like a perhaps a 496. Okay? So when I do that for drag and drive, maybe with a turbo or supercharger or nitrous, okay, I could probably live. Okay, but I don't know if I can keep the valve train together because now it wants to RPM. Okay, remember, when you look at a mountain motor, 750, 800 cubic inch against a 500 cubic inch pro stock NHR legal, the 500 incher or 496, 498, they will leave the line hard. They always say that. It leaves harder than the mountain motors. But after that, the mountain motors, NA, we're talking NA, would start to march and leave the 500 cubic inch NHR legal 500 pro stock in the dust. Same configuration when you start to boost this thing. The revability is going to be there. And like I said, if I build a drag and drive short stroke big bore, I have to RPM it. I have to put some lift in it. But I don't know if it's going to survive. So this Coyote looks more and more unbeatable. All right? There are probably some other out there run maybe a little quicker or just as quick. But the question is, how long? All right, but just before we leave the subject here, I would say to you, I have one engine, all right, that's made over 1,000 at the back wheel with the camshaft, heads that are worked on, flows real good, all right? So the boost, if it read 16 pounds or 24 pounds or 28 pounds dead, after I worked on it, it's really about 4 pounds less, but making more power. Guess what? It made that much more power with a cam lift, maybe even 600. All right, I'll be truthful with you guys. This car made it under 600 lift. All right, over 1,000. 600 lift on a street car. Supercharged or turbo. You don't need very much. Whatever airflow is in there is going to get pushed in by the boost. All right? So that's something to think about. So maybe these mountain motors that are drag and drive, maybe they're also not lifting as high. Maybe with their big cubic inch, they might even have 750, just ramming a lot of boost. And the head probably flows optimized for that mid-lift flow, not an inch flow or inch lift. It's probably in the 750 range where they max out. So in order to take advantage of the lower lift scale and produce more.
To conclude this video, I really believe the smaller bore diameter is less susceptible under high boost from detonating because the ignition flame front can easily cover the much smaller piston bore than it is with the big mountain motors on boost or just big blocks on boost. Secondly, the very, very light valves, intake and exhaust, allows for Basically, good lift, not enough to overwhelm the springs, not like on the big blocks. Basically, you can get away with very light spring pressures and still rev to the moon because the valves are light, especially with their titanium 4 valves. Therefore, there's just no comparison. You have to lift the overhead valve, big bore, big block, a lot more than normal and try to survive that 500, 900, 600 mile drive from whatever state you have to get to your destination. No comparison. Third, when you look at the valve train layout, the valves would overheat on the overhead big blocks because the bigger bore has also exposes the bigger valves, intake and exhaust, to combustion heat, easily overheating the valve edges or the valve face. So there you go. Not only are you in trouble with your bore diameter too big, but the valves being too big is also exposed to more combustion heat. Next is the RPM potential of a small block. With the big block, the efficiency goes down. Small engines, higher RPM will produce more power, especially on the top end. Therefore, if you have an excess of 1500 to 2000 RPM more towards the big end or your rev range, you can gear down the engine so much more lower than the typical big block. Therefore, he has a torque, but you have the RPM, so you're geared down much lower than a comparable big block. Therefore, you can leave as strong as he does quite a ways off the line. But if you notice, Brett LaSalle's engine, the mile an hour is about 15, 20 miles an hour slower than the big blocks. But he gets there quicker, telling us you got a lot of gear that's working for you. Therefore, when you combine the possibility of less detonation with a smaller bore and the possibility of cooler running intake and exhaust valves compared to the big bore, big valve configuration, you can actually boost more. So if the big block is boosting 50 or 45 or maybe even lower, but on the smaller engine you can boost a lot higher, maybe 60, 70, you may be much bigger, but the total engine airflow or intake airflow that's going in to the smaller engine is probably just as much or could be a little bit more, especially at high RPM.